I'd like to thank the University of Sydney and in particular the Sydney Environment Institute for the opportunity to present my research here, but also to participate in the workshops yesterday. So today we're looking at turbulent waters, slavery in the fishing industry, but with a particular focus on an area very close to home, New Zealand, and slavery in the New Zealand fishing industry. But firstly, if we look at some of these are images that have flashed across our screens or we've seen in print media in recent years. Cambodian and Burmese fishermen enslaved in the Thai fishing industry, where they encountered horrendous working conditions and experiences. Slavery in the fishing industry is not contained just to one national context, i.e. Thailand, or even two national contexts. Slavery in the fishing industry is widespread. It's occurred in Ireland, Scotland, elsewhere in Europe, Africa, and as I said, much closer to home, and it's occurred in New Zealand waters. So we're going to be looking at slavery in New Zealand waters, and this is research that I've undertaken with Glenn Simmons over the course of probably 5 or 6 years now that we've been looking at slavery in the fishing industry. The starting point was a project that I received or worked on for the Ministry of Fisheries, as it was then called in New Zealand. The Ministry of Fisheries was very interested in understanding how much fish that was caught in New Zealand waters was sent to China for value-added processing before being sent to key export markets in Europe, North America, or even brought back and sold in the New Zealand domestic market. During the course of that research, we identified a business model that was based on slavery. And so we were very interested into what was happening in the New Zealand fishing industry. And then in August 2010, the Oyang 70 vessel sunk off the coast of New Zealand with a loss of 6 lives. The survivors were rescued by a New Zealand vessel, a New Zealand fishing vessel in the area, and the survivors recounted horrific conditions aboard that vessel. The following year, in 2011, Indonesian crew members walked off a South Korean fishing vessel in Auckland, the Shinji. They were followed a month later by Indonesian crew off a second South Korean vessel, at this time in Lyttelton Port in the South Island. These crew were all citing labour and human rights abuses. Over the next year or so, crew of other South Korean vessels engaged in industrial action. So we're very interested in understanding what the situation was aboard these vessels and who is legally responsible for the working conditions of a largely invisible but vulnerable workforce aboard those foreign charter vessels. So a brief overview of the New Zealand fishing industry and in particular the foreign charter vessel sector in order to set the context as to why slavery was occurring in New Zealand waters. Foreign charter vessels began fishing in New Zealand's exclusive economic zone in the late 1970s. At that time, New Zealand companies didn't have the vessel capacity to fish their allocated entitlements. And so what the government at the time did was they set up an interim measure whereby New Zealand companies could enter into a joint venture arrangement with foreign companies to fish New Zealand's entitlements in those waters. And that was seen as an interim measure until New Zealand companies built up their capacity. The vessels were chartered fully crewed and operated by foreign operators. So recently what was in the foreign charter vessel sector, we'd have vessels from different countries come in, fish in the waters, but if we're talking specifically about the South Korean vessels, the vessels would come, fish in New Zealand waters, they would be crewed by South Korean officers and migrant crew from elsewhere in Asia. What was happening aboard these foreign charter vessels was debated in Parliament in the 1990s. Parliament recognised that there were slave-like conditions aboard these vessels. And in 1996, Parliament amended the Fisheries Act to ensure that the Minimum Wage Act applied to crew on board those vessels. So they would be entitled to the New Zealand minimum wage. However, the Minimum Wage Act was not effectively enforced on board those foreign charter vessels, and claims of exploitation continued to emerge within the industry. In 2006, the government introduced a voluntary code of practice. This was a widely debated initiative, and it was seen by some as unwanted government interference. The government did it again to try and reinforce that the Minimum Wage Act would apply to foreign crew working aboard foreign charter vessels operating in New Zealand waters. So the 2010-2011 fishing year, which was when we began our research, there was 27 foreign charter vessels operating in New Zealand waters. 13 of those were South Korean vessels. So they were significant players in the industry, and foreign charter vessels caught 51% of major fish species. And our research focused entirely on South Korean foreign charter vessels. Methods: we undertook semi-structured interviews, around 300, with foreign crew and industry personnel. The foreign crew were predominantly from Indonesia, but we also interviewed those from Burma, Vietnam, China, and the Philippines. We undertook those interviews between 2011 and 2014. So these foreign crew had worked on 19 South Korean foreign charter vessels over a period of time. So it wasn't just the crew that were currently working on the vessels, but those that had worked over a period of time, and some of them had worked on more than one foreign charter vessel. At the same time, we collected a vast amount of documentation, some of that obtained under the New Zealand Official Information Act. We also obtained employment contracts, manning agents, wage calculation sheets, pay slips, evidence of recruitment fees paid, security paid. So a vast array of documentation. And what did we find? We found that the issue of forced labour or slavery in New Zealand waters actually began at the recruitment stage. So it began in Indonesia, where crew would sign up with manning agents in order to obtain work aboard a foreign fishing vessel. So the crew were recruited through crewing agents in Indonesia. Those in Burma were recruited through crewing agents in Burma. The crew were required to pay recruitment fees to the manning agent, and these could be significant recruitment fees in terms of dollar amount. They were also required to provide guarantees, land deeds, house titles, motorbike titles, and other assets. The more lucrative position aboard a vessel, whether it was whatever country's waters, so if a crew member wanted to come and fish on a vessel in New Zealand as opposed to another country's waters, or a certain position aboard a vessel, or a particular vessel itself, often a bribery situation would emerge, and so crew would be engaged in negotiations with the manning agent, and for the more lucrative position they would have to pay more or be willing to pay more. For the Indonesian crew, they signed an employment contract with the promise of $250 to $500 a month. These are crew largely from Tegau in central Indonesia, where the poverty line is $75 a month. So an opportunity to work aboard a fishing vessel earning $250 to $500 a month was significant for them. However, what the crew didn't realise was, in the vast array of documents that the manning agent handed them to sign, and some in languages that they didn't understand, or they were required to sign blank pages or the text was covered up, they were actually signing 3 different contracts. They were signing an Indonesian contract, a New Zealand contract, which was required by Immigration New Zealand, as well as a South Korean contract. So each contract was designed to meet the regulatory requirements of the Pacific country. And they were actually operating or employed under the Indonesian contract. What we discovered was that crew were deceived about their wages, their work, housing conditions, and vessels right from the very beginning. They would sign up to work on one vessel and they would end up working on another vessel. And you might say, well, yeah, why is that important? Because crew told us that, these are crew that have been back to New Zealand and worked on more than one vessel, that they kind of knew which were the bad vessels and the bad captains. They wouldn't work on those vessels, and so they requested another vessel but ended up working on a vessel where they would be exploited. Okay, once they arrived in New Zealand, what were conditions like on board many of those South Korean foreign charter vessels? The conditions were very harsh. There were unsafe and unsanitary conditions, and the living quarters were cramped, damp, and filthy. They talked about having to use old dirty mattresses or using old blankets for mattresses. And when they asked the captain if the bedding had been washed, they would be abused. So the accommodation had little or no heating. Now this quote here the first quote is from a New Zealand observer aboard one of those vessels. He described the vessel as a floating freezer, absolutely appalling conditions, just like a slum. There are definitely human rights abuses out there. They are slave ships. Okay? So that was an observer describing the conditions on board a vessel. A number of crew talked about the drinking water. It's a rusty colour. The food supplies were locked up. If they asked for more food, they would be abused by the Koreans. Crew aboard one vessel were fed fish bait, not just ordinary fish bait, but rotten fish bait. One crew member recounted that he had asked for a piece of fruit. They were allowed one piece of fruit a month. In contrast, the Korean officers had access to food whenever they wanted to, and the food and water was of a better quality. The second quote, also from a New Zealand observer, where he said the crew lived like rats. Very long shifts, 16 to 18 hour days were common, 7 days a week for the length of their contract for 2 years. For some, they worked shifts of over 30 hours. Their breaks were curtailed or not permitted. Some worked excessive shifts of 53 hours. Crew would beg for a break or fall asleep while they're working. Crew were forced to sign blank timesheets. The officers would then fill in the hours worked. Of course, it wasn't an accurate reflection of the hours, or false timesheets. And if they refused to sign, then they were subject to abuse. They also had to accept unspecified illegal deductions from the pay. One interviewee told us how he was required to sign the timesheets for his entire shift. So to sign, the other crew members' signatures. And at the end, when he did that, the captain smiled because he was happy. Crew were denied bathroom breaks and would end up urinating on the fish in the fish hold. A New Zealand Department of Labour audit that was undertaken in 2004 acknowledges abuse that was happening in the industry. If anyone stands against this abuse, it has been known for them to be taken to a private cabin and beaten. A significant physical, sexual and mental assault happening on board many of these vessels. Some distressing experiences that crew recounted. Inhumane punishments were common. Sometimes for just a minor infraction, crew were punished. They punished me because I connected the wrong cable. They told me to stand up on deck in poor weather from 1 to 6 o'clock in the evening. So 5 hours in poor conditions on the deck for connecting the wrong cable. The second quote, I think I will always remember this interviewee demonstrating this to us, and he was quite emotional about it. He was sitting there eating lunch, minding his own business, when the bosun came up behind him, placed a rice sack over his head, and began to punch the back of his head until he had trouble breathing. Okay. For talking, this is one crew member who had newly arrived aboard the vessel. He was hired to work on the deck. At the end of the shift, his shift on the deck, he was required by the officers to go down into the processing factory. He'd never worked in a processing factory before, so he asked a fellow crew member, "What do I do? How do I do it?" For talking, his mouth was taped over with packing tape. Another case where a crew member jumped overboard to escape being shot by the captain with a flare gun. A number of crew ordered into a minus 40-degree freezer as a punishment. Incidents of sexual abuse were very widespread and common on board a number of these vessels. This is just one quote of a number, but this is one interviewee talking about a fellow crew member. "My crew member was raped in my cabin beneath my bunk many times on each trip. To make us shut our mouths, the officers paid money." That crew member, he was very emotional about it, and I think felt a lot of guilt because what was happening to a fellow crew member. When vessels were in port, crew could not easily leave their vessels. Security guards were employed to watch and follow the crew when they're in port. Okay, so if we look at this two comparison here, okay, so on the left, there's a foreign crew working on a foreign charter vessel in New Zealand waters. The column on the right is a foreign crew working on a New Zealand flagged vessel in New Zealand waters. So let's contrast the difference. The foreign crew working on a foreign charter vessel would earn between $6,700 to $11,600 per annum. Employment, as I said, is through the manning agents who require money and collateral, so the land, the house titles, the cash. The salary of $230 to $500 per month was paid to the manning agent, of which 50% was paid to the family, and the remaining was withheld by the manning agent, who would pay it at the end of the 2-year contract, less fees. On average, 16 hours a day, so 112 hours per week. No days off. Talked about the timesheets. The signature on the New Zealand contracts, on some of them were forged. We obtained copies of the New Zealand contracts. We'd show them to our interviewees, and they would say, "That's not my signature." A bonus of $250 to $350 per month was paid in cash at the end of the contract at the airport. And this was paid, the money was in an envelope and handed to the crew right before they went through immigration. So they had no opportunity to challenge or question the amount of money that was in their envelope. And there was nothing to account for the paperwork to account for the money. Now, for those crew that had signed, that were working in New Zealand waters, and they'd signed those Indonesian contracts, they could be fined between $2,000 to $10,000 US for abandoning their contract, even if they were seeking refuge from abuse. So they'd be fined when they went home. Forced to engage in exploitive activities, and I'll go on and talk about that. Okay, contrast that with foreign crew working on board New Zealand flag vessels. So crew, this is one particular company here. There was transparency with the contracts, timesheets, wage calculations sheets, employment costs. The New Zealand minimum wage of $15 per hour was paid. Crew would work 6 hours on, 6 hours off. And the payment, importantly, the payment went to individual crew bank accounts in New Zealand. So the company would have, Westpac Mobile, pull up at the port, sign the crew up to bank accounts, and the money would be paid into that account. And what this company had effectively done was taken the power away from the manning agent or the employment agent in Indonesia. Okay, so they're working on board these vessels, horrendous conditions. What options were there available for crew to exit their contracts? 4 points of exit. The first is crew members desert their vessels with very far-reaching consequences. Those huge fines that I talked about. For crew where the relentless abuse was so unbearable, some crew deserted the vessels when the vessels were in port. One deserter paid $3,000 in recruitment fees and as part of his contract forfeited 3 months' wages as collateral for getting the job. When he deserted his vessel, that placed his family in significant debt. His family were in debt bondage for up to 6 years. His brother was fined and the assets seized. So these far-reaching consequences, even beyond just the migrant fisher himself. The second option, some crew were sent home before completing their contract. Illness, injury, not working hard enough, or because the captain didn't like them. Okay, when they were sent home early, they still experienced those severe contractual penalties. Others complete their contract, but their exit can be delayed, and not all the wages that they are owed were paid on their return to Indonesia. And the fourth option is the crew from a number of South Korean foreign charter vessels that walked off their vessels in New Zealand waters. So they walked off en masse, they undertook industrial action, they exercised their agency, but ultimately they returned home. Particularly for number 1 and number 2, those crew would be blacklisted by their agents. If we look at this advertisement here, this was taken out in the Otago Daily Times, and it was a reward of $1,000 offered for information that leads to the whereabouts of an Indonesian crew member who had deserted the Oyang 70 vessel when it was in port. Okay, if we look at this here, this extract from a contract, we have an individual working agreement between the employer and the employee. If we look at clause F here, crew shall bear round-trip expenses for the crew, and this is, it's translation, it's not proper English, for the crew who leaves the vessel by the reason of discipline, as long as the crew was not being beaten, tortured by the Korean crew members. So it was obvious in that contract that what was happening on board some of these vessels were known by the Korean employers. Okay, I have, please, a short video clip here to show you.
Masih susah untuk cari kerjaan di darat, apalagi di Indo, orangnya banyak, pekerjaannya sedikit, jadi terlalu susah.
diteruskan karena saya itu melihat dari teman-teman atau kabar bahwa si yang di kapal itu mencukupi gitu.
Dari adik saya 2.500.000, dari ibu saya sendiri.
Saya nggak punya uang buat membiayai keluarga saya untuk menyekolahkan anak-anak saya, jadi dikembangkan gitu. Barangkali bermanfaat, akhirnya tanah itu saya gadekan.
Jaminan 5 juta sama PPKP motor.
Terus dengan membawa keluarga untuk bertanggung jawab. Jadi ada 3, jadi ada 4 persyaratan yang untuk mempertanggungjawabkan saya bila ntar
Memberikan jaminan. Saya bayar uang fee 3 juta.
berat sekali. Cuman untuk mengisi kebutuhan perut emang itu menekan.
Apa yang terjadi kalau misalkan kamu nggak bisa bayar?
Kalau saya nggak bisa bayar, terus saja tanah saya itu digarap dia terus, digarap orang terus.
Casnya nggak tahu kenapa besar-besar gitu loh.
Saya kan punya surat pernyataan di atas materai kalau nggak finish kontrak 2 tahun atau melarikan diri itu didenda $2.000.
Terus sertifikat tanah ditahan, kalau nggak ada sertifikat tanah, ijazah ditahan sama perusahaan. Dan kita nggak bisa ambil karena
kemungkinan besar itu sebagai alat untuk kita kerja di sini. Kalau tidak ada garansi yang diberikan kru sama agen, kalau kita mendapat perlakuan, ya kan, mendapat perlakuan yang tidak adil, caci maki atau apa, kita bisa bebas. Karena ada garansi yang diberikan. Jadi kita itu ingat-ingat ke belakang lah.
kita kalau dipukul itu, kita kalau mau balas mikir-mikir lagi gitu loh. Pukul beneran dia. Pukul sininya
Disabet begini. Cebrut gitu kan.
Anak lamun langsung ditengkel lehernya, Bu, begitu. Kalian kaget.
Saya langsung kena pukul belakang ini.
Udah gini aja Pak, saya kasih contoh. Bapak kita papasan. Wah, sih ya, bok. Udah.
terus dia marah-marah. Orang Vietnamnya dipukulin, diinjak, kepalanya dibenturin ke pintu, jeder gitu.
Kemudian dia dipanggil, akhirnya dia dimasukkan dalam satu kamar, dan orang Korea itu ada 3 orang saat itu, mandor factory sama wakil, kemudian sama anak buah ada lagi 3 orang, 4 orang saat itu masuk, itu digebukin di dalam kamar, Ibu. Itu keluar sudah bonyok semua mukanya. Aduh, kami ya Allah pada nangis semua, ini gimana ini?
Kalau penangkapan saya nyampe 2 hari, terus tidur 4 jam, mulai lagi terus kayak itu.
Sehari-harinya yang paling
pendek. Yang paling pendek itu sekitar 18 jam. Terus kalau mau pas lagi ada ikan 18 jam, terus kelar mau masuk ke tempat tidur, terus ternyata udah tarik lagi, akhirnya kerja lagi.
Terus kalau ngantuk itu kadang-kadang dicolok itu kan mandornya keliling, terus keliling itu dari sini ke tempat itu keliling muter. Kalau ada yang ngantuk langsung dicolok matanya itu.
Iya, dikasih 3 jam tidur aja, terus kita kerja kurang lebih 20 jam lebih dulu baru anak-anak udah pada ngantuk.
Pokoknya terus rolling terus. Jadi nggak ada waktu istirahat lah.
Ada yang dipukul pakai kayu lah, ada yang ditampar, ada yang mesti salah, yang mesti kena. Langsung itu dia langsung sendiri yang nampar. Ada yang berani lain-lainnya, itu langsung katanya. Kalau
Kerja kesel-kesel dan badan pada sakit, kepala selalu digeblak, kaki kadang ditendang, suruh cepat-cepat, terkadang.
Kalau kerja di kapal itu kayaknya jarang komplain, Bu. Masalahnya apa? Jangankan komplain, nggak komplain aja sering kena pukul. Bagaimana kita mau komplain? Mungkin digebuk sampai mati mungkin, Bu.
Saya paksa pokoknya seperti itu. Seperti saya juga direndahin di situ, merasa terhina, dilecehkan juga. Seolah-olah saya itu nggak ada gunanya buat dia.
Dianggap babu banget gitu, Ini rendah banget seperti ya mungkin melebihi daripada ini kita sepertinya sama orang Korea.
Kami ini kan budak gitu kan. Kalau dulu budak itu kan nggak ada bayaran gitu kan. Kalau sekarang kan budak tapi dibayar. Disebut budak tetap perlakuannya sama kayak budak-budak zaman dulu, kayak penekanan. Kami nggak bisa keluar.
Dan kapan ini akan berakhir? Itu yang pertanyaan saya tuh. Nggak tahu kapan akan berakhir. Mungkin berakhirnya mungkin
And as I mentioned, the crew were forced to engage in illegal fishing practices, such as dumping and the high grading of fish. And while there were observers aboard some of these vessels, crew would say that the dumping would actually often occur when the observers were asleep. In a recent study, we found that catches were routinely dumped by foreign charter vessels, a significant amount. Okay, this first quote here, if there were no observers, the officers were happy. Okay, they could take as much fish as they like, and what they caught didn't satisfy them, they would just throw it overboard and keep the best quality. And that was what a lot of the dumping was. It was about keeping the best quality, the right size, the right species. As the second catch comes in and we are still processing the first catch, then we keep the fresh fish and throw the old fish away. A lot of that would already be damaged, and so they would keep the fresh fish. Okay, and the quote finishes normally between 1/4 and 1/3 of the catch, but sometimes can be half of the catch that was dumped. I have another video clip here about dumping and the dumping of a basking shark.
A basking shark alive but severely injured on the deck of the Oyang 77, a Korean-owned vessel fishing at Murno Bank off Christchurch. In a bungled attempt to pull it off the deck, the shark's tail was ripped off.
They're harmless species, so it's always sad to see something like that get killed. They've been protected under the Wildlife Act since 2010 and the Fisheries Act as well, so they're protected within New Zealand waters.
Basking sharks are the second largest fish in the world behind whale sharks and eat nothing but plankton. It's not illegal to accidentally catch them, but sources told 3 News the catch was never reported, which is illegal. As one of the Indonesian crew films, the captain instructs them to try a different tactic to get it off the deck. And eventually the 5-ton fish is dragged overboard. Below deck, there are more wasteful practices. This is the chute for scraps that are thrown overboard. But among the heads and offal are whole ling, a sought after and valuable species.
It is illegal fish dumping, and in my view it forms part of New Zealand's invisible catch, that it's not recorded anywhere.
One place it was recorded is in this affidavit from the fisherman who filmed the pictures. He claimed fish dumping happened once a week. The biggest amount thrown overboard, he estimated, was 4,000 pans, which are these steel trays, the equivalent of around 50 tonnes of fish.
If I take all of our research into account and some of the modelling that we've done, I would estimate the average dumping at somewhere between 40 and 50% on these Korean foreign charter vessels.
The Ministry of Primary Industries thinks the dumping of total catch is lower than that, but concedes it is a problem.
It is a significant issue when it does occur, for a number of reasons. One is it's a waste of a valuable resource to us all. The second is that it impacts the sustainability of the stocks that are being discarded.
The Oyang 77 is currently in Littleton, but going nowhere as it's been refused a new registration. The ministry has also taken action against 5 officers from the sister ship Oyang 75, who are being prosecuted for fish dumping. The Christchurch company that chartered both vessels is Southern Storm Fishing. A company agent who didn't want to speak on camera says they're staying silent because they feel they've been unfairly treated in the media. He also says he doesn't want to make much public because of the current cases that are before the courts. Michael Morrow, 3 News.
So what was the government's response? The abuses, both labour abuses and environmental abuses, were so great that they could no longer be ignored. Okay, so they were so offensive, so obvious and clearly going to continue that the government acted. The government launched a ministerial inquiry into the foreign charter vessel sector, and the inquiry panel reported back with 12 key findings. But most importantly, what the government did was they amended the Fisheries, Foreign Charter Vessels and Other Matters Amendment Bill. And what the amendment bill did was required by the 1st of May this year that all foreign vessels fishing in New Zealand waters be reflagged as New Zealand vessels, which would bring them under New Zealand law. There was the spotlight shone on those excesses, the way that the migrant workers were treated, the environmental abuses were great, media, trade unions, activists, academics. And so that was a significant development in New Zealand, was the Foreign Charter Vessel and Other Matters Amendment Bill. Regulatory responses at the end of the TV3 news clip, there was mention of this. Indonesian fishers were witnesses in the Crown's prosecution against Korean officers from 4 foreign charter vessels. These were prosecutions for environmental offences. So the officers were convicted of dumping and high grading offences and for the filing of false catch returns. Some were prosecuted by Maritime New Zealand for the illegal dumping of oil at sea. In sentencing the captain of the Oyang 77, the judge said the offending was, difficult to discover and prosecute. The Korean officers were fined. In addition to that, all 4 vessels, the Malala 201, Oyang 75, Oyang 77, and Seresti 707, all those vessels were in theory forfeited to the Crown. Under the Fisheries Act, the Malala 201 vessel was sold and subsequently sent to a scrapping yard, but the Oyang 75, the Oyang 77 and the Seresti 707 had already left New Zealand's territorial waters. This here, the latest in health and safety. A crew member welding on the deck of a vessel with a plastic bag over his head. Thank you.